A 2-year debt justice campaign by Christian Aid Nigeria in partnership with CISLAC and Tax Justice and Governance Platform has highlighted the increasing role of private creditors in Nigeria's debt crisis and its devastating human effects. Speaking at the closeout ceremony, the country director Christian Aid UK Nigeria, Temitope Fashola, said the organization have produced 2 knowledge products that highlighted the increasing role of private creditors in Nigeria's debt crisis and its human and social costs as part of its efforts towards complementing this concern and the implications of poor tax expenditure governance on debt management. Clevis correspondence brings us details. Nigeria currently grapples with its worst economic situation in decades, marked by a consistent decline in federal government revenue and a skyrocketing debt burden. The country's debt has reached a staggering 121 trillion naira, with a debt to GDP ratio of 49.5% and a debt to revenue ratio of 68%, far exceeding the recommended threshold. The government has relied heavily on loans from commercial banks, often under unfavorable terms, to bridge budgetary shortfalls. This has resulted in unsustainable debt servicing costs, diverting funds away from critical sectors like education, health, agriculture, and social welfare.
We know that Nigeria is in a very difficult economic situation as we speak. So we have to consciously manage our economic situation so that we don't inflict more pain on ordinary citizens through borrowing. And that's why for us, for the last 2 years, we've done some work to really understand Nigeria's debt profile and its implication on ordinary citizens and what we can do differently to ensure that we can change that paradigm. I know there are other engaging advocacies going on, not just in Nigeria, but even regionally and globally, around issues around debt forgiveness and so on, not just for Nigeria, but for a number of African countries. But it's important that we also internally think through what ways we can really manage our debt profile that will not affect us on the long term like it did in the early 2000s.
And this situation is precipitated mostly by our debt crisis, right? And what is contributing to this debt crisis? Quite a number of issues. Firstly, is the fact that we are failing to formulate realistic budgets. So our budgets are overbloated, and so you have huge budget deficits because your revenue is way lower than your expenditure. And then when you have budget deficits, those budgets have to be financed through borrowings. Now, borrowings are typical everywhere, but the Nigerian situation is that while we may have the opportunity to borrow from domestic markets, from bilateral creditors, from multilateral creditors, our opportunity to access those loans keeps shrinking because we are a low-income country. For that reason, we find ourselves at the mercy of private creditors. Private creditors offer non-concessional loans. These are loans that have very high interest rates, loans that basically have no moratoriums, more often than not, and they have very short maturity periods. So your repayment periods are very short. Now, while they may not take up as much of our debt profile as the multilateral and bilateral lenders, they take up a significant percentage of our debt servicing costs. And now this comes at an expense of financing critical social sectors like education, like health, like agriculture, like social welfare. And so while you're taking this away, while you're reducing funding for these, it has implications for human rights.
Nigeria's economic future hangs the balance, hence it's imperative that the government and stakeholders take immediate action to address the debt crisis and ensure a sustainable economic future for generations to come. Christian Aid Nigeria and its partners are working towards a collective agenda to strengthen debt transparency and accountability in Nigeria. It called on policymakers and stakeholders to join forces on promoting a policy shift that reduces the country's over-reliance on borrowing. Florence Joshua reporting for Clearview News Desk.